like ever since it happened, my life just like hit like a hole. Like even going out, you know, we're always paranoid somebody's gonna see us, get spotted, try to beat us up potentially, or even worse.
You just met these young men more recently. And are you confident that these young men had nothing to do with it?
What if the biggest question in the Nolan Wells case is no longer just what happened on Horn Island, but what investigators are about to reveal to a grand jury? Because tonight, there is a major development that could determine where this investigation goes next. The Jackson County District Attorney, Angel Myers McIlrath, has now addressed the growing pressure surrounding Nolan's death again. And her message was very clear. She says she cannot publicly release investigative information simply because the public is demanding answers. She says doing so could violate the law and potentially interfere with the investigation.
I understand the public's urgency to know what happened to Nolan, but we are not taking time for time's sake. We are taking the time required to complete the work this investigation demands. Since Nolan was reported missing, local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies have worked around the clock investigating what happened to him. Every piece of evidence must be examined. Every credible lead must be followed to its conclusion. Every witness interview must be analyzed in context of all other evidence. The pressure for answers does not change what the work requires.
Here's where this gets interesting. The DA says her office intends to present a thorough investigation to a grand jury once the investigation is complete. And that means the evidence investigators have collected, including the completed state medical examiner's findings, is expected to become part of that process. The official autopsy has been completed, but its results have not been made public. For Nolan's family, however, waiting has been incredibly difficult. Nolan was only 18 when he went to Horn Island with friends over the 4th of July weekend. He was later reported missing, and his body was recovered from the water near the island 2 days later. Since then, questions about his final movements, the circumstances surrounding his death, and the investigation itself have continued to grow. And now there's another issue attracting attention: Nolan's cell phone. His family and the DA's office had agreed to a joint forensic examination of the phone, but according to recent reporting, that examination has still not taken place because of disagreements over the logistics and control of the process. The phone could potentially contain information about Nolan's movements and communications before his death. Meanwhile, Nolan's family and their attorneys have continued calling for greater transparency and have sought a federal review of the case. The Congressional Black Caucus has also called for a closer look at the investigation. So right now, we're left with a case where one of the most important pieces of evidence, the official autopsy findings, has not been released publicly. The cell phone examination remains unresolved, and the DA says the completed investigation will ultimately go before a grand jury. But what exactly does the grand jury process mean? And could it finally answer the question that Nolan's family and so many people following this case have been asking since July? That's where this story gets even more complicated. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. And if you want to stay updated as new verified information comes out, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because in the next part, we're going back to the beginning of Nolan's final known day, and the timeline that investigators are now working to piece together. But the timeline investigators are now examining contains a major unanswered question. What happened between Nolan's last confirmed moments on Horn Island and the time his body was recovered? Nolan Wells had traveled to Horn Island on July 4 with friends for what was supposed to be a holiday celebration. According to authorities, he was last seen on the island, and his body was recovered 2 days later. That gap in time has become one of the central issues surrounding the investigation. An independent analytical review commissioned by Nolan's family's legal team reportedly examined photographs, videos, GPS information, and witness accounts. According to the review, the available material still leaves what investigators described as a significant gap in the timeline. Importantly, the review did not conclude that anyone committed a crime. Instead, it identified questions that the family believes still need to be answered. And then there is Nolan's cell phone. The phone has become another important point of contention. Recent reporting says Nolan's family and authorities have discussed a joint forensic examination, but disagreements over how that examination should be conducted have delayed the process. The family believes the device could potentially provide information about Nolan's final hours. At the same time, investigators have not publicly announced that the phone contains evidence proving foul play. That distinction is extremely important, because while social media has produced countless theories about what happened to Nolan, authorities still have not announced that anyone has been charged with causing his death. The official investigation is moving toward the grand jury, and the state autopsy has been completed. However, those findings have not been released publicly and are expected to be presented to the grand jury instead. Meanwhile, Nolan's family is continuing its own push for answers. Their attorneys have been examining the evidence independently, including questions surrounding the ocean currents and how Nolan's body was eventually recovered. And this is where the case becomes even more complicated, because investigators are looking at one timeline. Nolan's family and their experts are examining another. And somewhere between those pieces of evidence may be the answers everyone has been waiting for. But before anyone can say exactly what happened, investigators still have to establish the facts. And the next major step could come when the evidence reaches the grand jury. So the question now isn't simply whether there are unanswered questions. There clearly are. The bigger question is whether the evidence currently being gathered will finally explain what happened to Nolan Wells. And that's what we'll examine next. If you're following this case, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And make sure you subscribe, because as soon as verified developments emerge from the investigation or grand jury process, we'll break them down here. But there is another piece of this case that investigators and Nolan's family are still trying to understand, and it involves the people who were with him on Horn Island that day. According to recent interviews, some of Nolan's friends have described their final interaction with him. They say Nolan chose to remain on the island while they headed back toward the mainland after the boat began experiencing problems. Their account is that Nolan intended to get another ride back. That explanation has become one of the most heavily debated parts of the case. Nolan's family has questioned why he would stay behind without his phone and keys, and they have said they believe aspects of the story deserve much closer examination. But there is an important distinction here. The friends have not been publicly charged with causing Nolan's death, and authorities have not announced that their statements have been proven false. Instead, investigators are left with the difficult task of comparing different accounts with physical evidence and other information collected during the investigation. And one piece of evidence could potentially help reconstruct Nolan's final hours: his cell phone. The phone has become a major point of contention, because Nolan's family believes it could contain information about his movements and communications before his death. Recent reporting says the family and authorities have discussed conducting a joint forensic examination of the device, but disagreements over how that examination should be handled have delayed the process. That means one of the most potentially important digital pieces of evidence has remained at the center of a dispute while the investigation continues. At the same time, the official autopsy has been completed, but the public still does not know what the state medical examiner concluded. The district attorney has said the findings will be presented to the grand jury along with the rest of the investigative evidence. She has also pushed back against demands to release information publicly, saying she has a legal responsibility to protect the investigation and allow the process to work. And that brings us to the biggest question yet. If the grand jury receives the autopsy findings, witness statements, digital evidence, and everything else investigators have collected, what will they conclude about Nolan's death? Right now, nobody outside that process can honestly say. What we do know is that the case has attracted national attention, with Nolan's family receiving support from organizations including the NAACP, while members of Congress have called for a federal review. So this isn't simply a story about a missing teenager anymore. It's a case involving an ongoing death investigation, competing questions about the timeline, an unreleased official autopsy, disputed access to digital evidence, and a family demanding answers. And as the grand jury process approaches, every one of those pieces could become important. If you're following Nolan's story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And make sure you subscribe because in the next part, we're going to look at the federal review being requested and why the involvement of the NAACP and Congressional Black Caucus could put even more pressure on officials. And now, the pressure on investigators is becoming impossible to ignore. Nolan Wells' family is no longer asking for answers alone. The NAACP has officially joined the family's legal effort, saying it will provide additional investigative and legal resources to help uncover what happened and push for greater transparency. That development came just days after members of the Congressional Black Caucus asked the U.S. Department of Justice to conduct an independent federal review of Nolan's death. The DOJ has confirmed that it received the request and that the matter is being reviewed by the appropriate personnel. But here's what makes this especially important. The request for a federal review does not mean the federal government has determined that wrongdoing occurred. It means Nolan's supporters believe the circumstances surrounding his disappearance and death deserve another level of scrutiny. And while that pressure is growing, the Jackson County District Attorney is standing by the local investigation. Her latest statement essentially says, "Let investigators finish their work." She says she cannot simply release information because people are demanding it publicly. She has a legal responsibility to protect the investigation, and she says the completed case will ultimately be presented to a grand jury. That puts everyone involved in a difficult position. Nolan's family wants answers now. Supporters want transparency now. But prosecutors say releasing information prematurely could interfere with the very investigation that's supposed to provide those answers. And there's another important piece still hanging over the case. The official state autopsy has been completed, but its findings have not been released publicly. Those findings are expected to be presented to the grand jury along with the rest of the investigative evidence, so the public still doesn't know exactly what the official medical examination concluded. And until that information becomes available through the legal process, there are limits to what anyone can responsibly say about Nolan's cause and manner of death. The family's independent examination has also left the manner of death undetermined, which is one reason their legal team continues pushing for additional investigation. For now, one thing is clear. The Nolan Wells case has moved far beyond a local investigation. The family has legal representation. The NAACP is involved. Congressional lawmakers have requested federal review, and the district attorney says a thorough case is being prepared for a grand jury. But the question everyone still wants answered remains the same. What happened to Nolan Wells during those final hours on Horn? Until investigators and prosecutors reveal what the evidence actually shows, that question remains open. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you're following this case closely, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next major development could come when the grand jury receives the evidence. And then came a meeting that Nolan Wells' family had been waiting for. On August 19, Nolan's mother, Christine Wonsley, met face-to-face with Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McIlrath for the first time since Nolan's body was recovered. The timing made the meeting even more emotional. It happened on what would have been Nolan's 19th birthday. Instead of celebrating with her son, his mother was sitting down with the prosecutor overseeing the investigation into his death. According to reports, the meeting was described as respectful. But respectful does not mean the questions have disappeared. Nolan's family is still searching for answers about what happened during those final hours on Horn Island, and the investigation remains active. The DA continues to maintain that she cannot publicly release investigative information while the case is ongoing. Her position remains that the evidence must be collected, reviewed, and eventually presented to a grand jury. And that means one of the biggest pieces of information the public is waiting for, the official state autopsy findings, still has not been released publicly. The state autopsy has been completed, but officials say the report will be part of the evidence presented to the grand jury. Meanwhile, Nolan's family continues its own push for answers. Their legal team has been pursuing additional forensic examinations and has questioned aspects of the timeline surrounding Nolan's disappearance. His cell phone remains another major point of interest. Recent reporting says the family and authorities have discussed a joint forensic examination. But disagreements over how that examination should be conducted have delayed it. So right now, there are several major pieces still waiting to come together: the official autopsy, the cell phone examination, the witness accounts, the timeline, and eventually the grand jury review. But here's something extremely important to remember. None of these developments by themselves prove that a crime occurred. Authorities have not announced a suspect in Nolan's death, and no one has been charged with causing his death. What they have said is that the investigation is ongoing, and that the evidence will ultimately be reviewed through the grand jury process. For Nolan's family, however, the wait continues. And after meeting with the DA on the day Nolan should have been celebrating his 19th birthday, one question remains at the center of everything. Will the evidence finally explain what happened to Nolan Wells? Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you want the next update as soon as verified information becomes available, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications.